All right, hello and welcome. This is the RATHSQUATCH and the Yab. We just did our retro wrestling review for the original WrestleMania I, which was at Madison Square Garden, New York, 1984. So I was 2 years old when this came out, so obviously didn't watch it live, or if I did, I was too young to remember it. But he's a little older than me, so he might have actually remembered when this took place.
I think I actually watched it on VHS.
Back
when it came when it was available to rent.
The old VHS. I used to go and take my parents. We used to let me rent the VHSs. We go to Blockbuster and get them or whatever whenever they came out. And then do you remember when you had the two VCRs and you could record one from the other?
Yep.
Oh, that was the greatest. I used to get all the Royal Rumbles and I'd record them so I could watch them over and over again in my room. But anyway, so interesting card, kind of a different thing because obviously it had never been done before prior to this, so there's a lot of stuff. Match number one consisted of the Executioner versus Tito Santana. Why don't you go and start and tell what you thought of the match?
I mean, I enjoyed it. It was great, seeing Tito Santana, one of the guys from the 70s and 80s. He pretty much dominated the Executioner. It surprised me just how much he dominated him at first, because I haven't seen the first WrestleMania in probably 20 years. So you're just used to today where like in a pay-per-view you're gonna have that back and forth, whereas here Tito just took it to him and just put him away pretty easily. It was just enjoyed the wrestling. Tito definitely had good repertoire. But other than that, it was just so one-sided, and you don't expect to see something like that during a pay-per-view.
Yeah, I think what was telling for me is you just from the promos in the beginning when the Executioner can barely stumble his way through the mic work, and then to actually get out there and wrestle, it was one of those matches that I think I like the intensity of it. I know we talked while it was on there the realism aspect of the way that it looked. I thought that the match was pretty well put together, and was, again, like you said, nice to see Tito Santana. So I gave this match an overall 2 stars out of 5 possible. It's maybe slightly underwhelming. It was a pretty short match. It was only 8 minutes or so, and was pretty one-sided. But obviously illustrated that Tito Santana deserved to be, in that contendership for the Intercontinental title.
And pretty much it showed the first bit of storyline for the event, where just the him back hunting for the rematch against Greg the Hammer Valentine for the Intercontinental title. But you didn't really get much play of it. It was just barely mentioned, but it did come into play later on and during the card.
All right, and what was your rating on that?
I agree with you. I think it was about 2.5, just because Tito just dominated. So it was entertaining, but it didn't have enough from the Executioner to really give it a higher rating.
Alrighty, well, that was the first match. So the second match was King Kong Bundy, just a giant of a man, versus Special Delivery or SD Jones. I vaguely remember SD Jones from when I was a little kid, but definitely wasn't a top-notch star at this time, whereas King Kong Bundy was sort of being brought out there as this mega power heel going into this match, a match that lasted, they said, 9 seconds. It was probably closer to 20 seconds, but because of the maybe 4 moves that were actually executed, King Kong Bundy into the corner of the ring, and then being the big avalanche and the big splash for the win. Obviously, this just being a squash match, I don't even know if it deserves a rating, but obviously I gave it a 1-star rating simply because it was so short.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you there. You pretty much saw here's where they're starting to build up the giants to fight Hulk Hogan during his reign, and he's a scary dude for the time. You look at his eyes on the camera, and it looked like he was dead inside.
Yeah, and I told
definitely again just surprising in today. You don't expect to see just a complete shutout on a pay-per-view.
Yeah, I said squashes happen, but generally not on the pay-per-view. That's one where, I can think back to Goldberg and Umaga and some of those guys who were just out there and their matches were 30 seconds because they just destroy guys. Or I can't, was it Big Show at one point was wrestling 3 guys at a time and stuff just to illustrate, you know, how big and nasty that he was. But yeah, obviously what they were trying to do was to push King Kong Bundy into that direction and get him more ready for Hulk Hogan. I had said that I thought King Kong Bundy kind of resembled what I would expect a Kingpin to look like from Marvel Comics, so that's interesting to see, because he's actually fairly agile man for his size.
Oh yeah, I was definitely surprised at that. You know, the speed in which he moved, you know, for the few seconds he was out there.
And looks like you gave that a 1-star rating as well. I guess just basically for what I said, the matchup was just so short, you can't really even give it a rating.
Yeah. Something I had forgotten was the fact that he was being managed by Jimmy about the South Heart.
Yeah.
So that was a surprise. Actually, I remember that he was he had Greg the Hammer Valentine, and you could see that it was mentioned either during this match or one of the later ones how he was just starting to assemble that stable, the Hart family, and later on the Attitude Era, and even in present day you'd have those factions, but back in the day I think this is when you first started to really see the Heenan family,
yeah.
the Hart Foundation, various stables, the Four Horsemen, in the NWA, but really started definitely seeing the genesis of the Attitude Era
and eventually the Mega Powers, and then into the
So, but that was I didn't remember that King Kong Bundy was with Jimmy Hart. I always thought of him as a Bobby Heenan guy, but I might have been just completely wrong.
Well, I think most of the guys who Jimmy Hart managed, they ended up switching because Jimmy Hart went to the Hart Foundation only naturally, but that didn't happen until Bret Hart came around.
Yeah.
Bret Hart didn't come around till a year after this. So, but once Bret Hart came around, he realized he needed Jimmy's help, and then they switched it all around. And that's sort of where all that began. And then Bobby Heenan was really working, as obviously he switches too, takes over Andre the Giant later on, and then the rest of the Heenan family, Haku, and all those guys.
Yeah, Bobby more just kind of feuded with Hogan.
Yeah.
Whereas Jimmy was kind of more handling the mid-card feuds.
Yeah, and the tag team divisions.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, the third match was the Maniac, Matt Bourne, versus Ricky Steamboat, prior to him being the Dragon. I thought in this match that Ricky Steamboat looked really good.
Definitely.
He was really fast. Everything he was performing was crisp. You could tell just on the level of wrestling that you had. This was another one of those matches where Matt Bourne just really wasn't even close to the level that Ricky Steamboat was at, and you could just tell by the basic wrestling.
Yeah, great showcase for Ricky. When I think of Ricky the Dragon, I think of 2 matches, or series of matches. First being with Randy Savage, WrestleMania 3,
which is still considered one of the greatest matches of all time.
And then I know he had a lot of memorable feuds with Ric Flair, in the NWA. I think in the '90s, and probably during the '70s and '80s, when he wasn't with the WWF. But again, just telling for the the bottom of the card, there's no storyline, there's no development like that, like we're used to. They're not talking about any reason why this match is happening other than that it's just another notch on the belt to to further their goals. There's no real climax to a feud that's happening here at WrestleMania 1, with the exception of a few of on the card later on the card.
I just didn't. I guess for me, you saw that the rare mixture of technical wrestling and speed. And you don't see that as often nowadays from guys Ricky's size. Most of those guys are the guys who are technical speed wrestlers are like the legit cruiserweights, the guys that are 200 pounds.
Yeah.
Ricky was probably 240 in this one, and he was moving as fast as those light heavyweight cruiserweight guys were moving around. But yeah, Matt Bourne was just overmatched. I still gave this match a 3-1 because Ricky did such a great job in the match overall. And 2, I thought that the way that they were trying to push him, and even Jesse doing his commentary, usually he says a lot of bad things about the good guys, in his commentary. He really didn't have much bad to say about Ricky Steamboat. So
I'd agree with that. Again, I also gave it a 3. It was a great showcase for Ricky Steamboat. But again, just the lack of offense from Bourne kept it from going any higher.
After that, we had kind of a different match, but David Sammartino versus Brutus Beefcake. Again, this is before he was Brutus the Barber Beefcake. David Sammartino having his father, the living legend, Bruno Sammartino, and then we had Luscious. What was his name? Can't remember now. But his nickname was Luscious, and he was the manager for Brutus Beefcake at the time. What'd you think of that match?
Actually, I think that was the first match at this point during the WrestleMania event that I couldn't either remember or just could tell just from years of watching wrestling. Like, okay, who do I expect to win? I wasn't actually sure who could win. It had a lot of back and forth. Both guys were new to relatively new to the craft at this point in time. I remember funny now, just thinking about it. When I first saw this as a kid, I had no idea who Bruno Sammartino is. I was all Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper. But now just seeing with hindsight now and just looking back and just seeing the crowd's reaction to Bruno was amazing. You could definitely feel the respect and the affection that New York crowd had for him. You can just see the way he moved at the end of the match. When the big brawl broke out, he was still in phenomenal shape. And you can see, why he was such a dominant force in the 70s.
And he had to be in his mid-50s at least, probably, huh?
Yeah, 40s or 50s, I'd say, yeah. But, definitely enjoyed the match. I enjoyed the fact that David was using a lot of that amateur background, which you see a little bit now and again, for some of the modern stars. But, that was really a big part of his main focus. But then he still, had that more, then he shifted, he could adapt with the professional moves. So it was a varied style.
Yeah.
And then it was good seeing Brutus before he had the barber shtick, and so just good solid heel. And it was an entertaining match back and forth. I think I gave it 3.5.
Yeah, I think that the only thing that held this match back where I didn't rate it any higher than a 3 was that for casual wrestling fans, this would have been a really boring match, I think. And you saw a lot of techniques that David was using that were popular in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and more so, like Lou's Thieves and the classic grappling, not so much even wrestling, the submissions and the joint holds and the stretch holds. You saw a lot of that from David Sammartino throughout this match, whereas Brutus Beefcake ran more of a traditional American style matchup. I liked it. I don't think it didn't really excite me, but it was a good match, and I think if you look at it from an entertainment standpoint, I wasn't that entertained, but from a technical standpoint and understanding the business of wrestling, I thought that it did a good job. I gave it a 3 overall.
Yeah, I think I gave it just a little bit slightly higher, just because it was the first match. I wasn't sure who was going to win, and the fact that it was going back and forth for the first time on the card. It wasn't just that straight domination that we'd seen on the earlier matches. So for that game, it gained a slightly higher rating in comparison to what we'd seen.
And then next we had the first championship match, which was Greg the Hammer Valentine, who was the Intercontinental Champion, and he went up against the Junkyard Dog in this matchup. Now, I hadn't got to see the Junkyard Dog wrestle in a long time, and watching him and Greg the Hammer Valentine go out, it was just kind of different. Junkyard Dog had a style that I can't even really describe in his way of wrestling. It was just a lot of just brawling and striking and headbutts, and it looked really brutal as far as the way it was being wrestled, whereas Hammer does the striking, but definitely more of a technician and submission specialist. Overall, they kind of went back and forth. It wasn't a long match. Kind of had a weird ending. You had Greg Valentine cheats, puts his feet in the ropes to pin the Junkyard Dog in the corner. Ref didn't see it. But then after the fact, Tito Santana, who was at the Junkyard Dog's corner, comes in and tells the referee what happened, and the referee decides to reverse the decision. And then they restart the count. Greg Valentine allows himself to be counted out, which, for those you don't know, if you're counted out or disqualified, you can't lose the belt. So, in the end, Junkyard Dog gains the victory, but Greg Valentine gets to retain the Intercontinental title. I gave this match 2.5. I thought it was just an average match.
Yeah. I enjoyed it. It was definitely, you could see, the start of the early start of the WWE, WWF back then, going to that sports entertainment method of presenting their show. Junkyard Dog came out to music. Had just interesting character. Again, you had Greg Valentine being managed by Jimmy Hart, part of that Hart family stable, and just going the back and forth of it all. Two distinct characters. Tito getting involved with it. Had a little bit of that. It had a little bit of actual storyline where he's trying to get back. At Greg Valentine. He's not going to let him get away with what he did to the Junkyard Dog. Definitely an unusual finish to the match. Whereas, he got the pin. It gets reversed. The match gets restarted, but then it just ends with the count out. So kind of make the crowd happy, but nothing else really happened.
Yeah, and like I said, I think maybe they did that to try to keep both strong, I guess, in their appearance, because technically Junkyard Dog gets the win, but Greg Valentine still gets to keep his title and look strong because he actually got the pinfall. So I don't know. I don't know if it led up to anything later on down the road with these guys, but I know Valentine and Tito Santana definitely had some classics after this.
Yeah. No, I don't think they had any real significant follow-up outside of maybe just, doing the house shows, rematches and whatnot, because, the main feud for the Intercontinental title at that point was really Greg Valentine and Tito Santana for that, for this, this time period, the next, year or so. So, again, I agree with the average match. I'd say 2.5 to 3, just because you kind of get into a little bit more of the story, having Tito Santana get involved. Junkyard Dog had a different style. Never seen so many headbutts in a match.
Yeah.
It was great seeing Greg Valentine. Locking in the trying to go for that figure 4 leg lock.
He's in good shape too.
You don't get to see that. You don't see that move a lot these days. So maybe it's nostalgia talking about it. I was kind of leaning more towards a 3.
Okay. Well, then you had the tag titles were on the line at the time. Barry Windham, who becomes one of the Four Horsemen later on down the road, and then you had Mike Rotundo, who later on becomes IRS. So these guys were in a battle against two classic WWF guys, Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik. What do you think of that match?
I think this was my favorite match of the event, actually. Had a lot of good action back and forth. You had two classic heels, the Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. From singing the Russian national anthem, to the finish. At the end with Freddie Blassie. Giving the Sheik the cane for them to get the win. A lot of good action. A lot of energy. I really enjoyed it, and I found I was pulling for the Sheik and Volkov. I was hoping that they were going to pull it out.
A little bit, yeah.
I had forgotten that they were the tag team champions, that they won it here, so that was a pleasant surprise. But definitely just great amount of action back and forth between both sides. I wasn't sure who was going to win. They were telling a pretty good story in the ring. Impressed by the performance of all four guys. So I would give this one 3.5.
Yeah, and I agree with you. That's where I had it as well. It was about a 3.5. I thought the crowd was into it, and this was that first match where we really saw the crowd getting real excited when these guys came out. And that was when Windham and Rotundo came out. They got real excited about it. I just like to watch it from the perspective of the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, both the guys that I really like. So watching both of those guys, even though Iron Sheik at that time sort of on the down half of his career at that point, still obviously looked like a legit dangerous guy out there wrestling. And when he comes off the ropes and does that elbow drop, from the guy sitting halfway across the ring, it was still awesome to watch him out there, and how athletic that he still was, even though you don't really think of Iron Sheik for his athleticism.
Yeah, not these days.
Yeah.
But you could definitely, you could buy, just like looking back, you could buy, I could definitely buy the fact that he was the WWF champion.
Yeah,
for a time.
Yeah.
Probably within the last year or so. I can't remember the exact dates, but Hulk Hogan hadn't been the champion that long, maybe about maybe a few months to a year. So the Sheik was they were mentioning the fact that he was the former champion, and you could buy it. He looked dangerous in the ring. He was athletic, powerful, and it was great seeing him win. And especially the fact that he cheated to win. That was awesome.
What I love is the promo afterward.
Yeah.
So they asked Freddie Blassie, where'd your cane go?
What cane?
What cane? What cane? I ain't no cane. The whole time. It's just, that's classic heel work, and I appreciated the way all that went. But I love Freddie Blassie as a manager. So I didn't really know how he was as a wrestler, but I know, obviously as a manager, he always was good, and his pencil neck geek references and stuff like that are always welcome. So it sounds like we're both in agreement on that one. We both had that as 3.5, and I would also say it was match of the night. Then we had a gimmick match. We had Andre the Giant versus Big John Studd in a body slam match. The whole premise of this one was the first individual that could slam the other would win. If Andre could not slam Big John Studd, he would have to retire from wrestling. If Big John Studd couldn't slam Andre, and Andre was able to get to slam him instead, then he would win. Was it $15,000?
$15,000.
Okay, so this is pretty much what you'd expect from two guys of their size. I mean, nearly 400 pounds for Big John Studd. Andre well over 400 pounds at the time. Some interesting things I thought in this match was just seeing how much bigger Andre was than Big John Studd, because I know Big John Studd is a large man. I remember him wrestling Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan looking small compared to Big John Studd, so you can only imagine how big Andre must have been. Just compared to those other wrestlers. Match went pretty much the way I would expect. I gave it a 3, slightly above average, not only just for the nostalgia value, watching both of those big guys out there doing their thing, but I also liked some of the lead up into it. Bobby Heenan's his promo in the beginning and just leading into the matchup and trying to, and then at the end, after Andre slams Big John Studd, running in there and stealing the money from Andre and running. But what did you think?
I kind of agree with you again. I gave it a 3. It was great seeing the two of them. I remember that match from when I was a kid. Great seeing Andre move, because he had so many he had so many health issues. WrestleMania 3. But I'm sure he was battling with them even now, but he was still in better shape at WrestleMania 1. Still put on a great show. Had a lot of energy. The crowd was into the match. It was just great actually seeing him move around and actually getting into it. Whereas with when you're watching WrestleMania 3, it's still a great match with him and Hogan, but you can see Andre's definitely protecting himself and always staying by the ropes, making sure he's able to perform. Whereas in here he was more free with his moves. You can tell he was still enjoying himself, and that was nice to see. And Big John Studd, again a classic heel. The '80s had a nice selection of heels.
Yeah, it reminds
Big John Studd was another one that you could have a fun enjoy to see fighting Andre.
It reminds me a lot of the heels in the Attitude Era, and I think that's why the heels in the Attitude Era eventually turned to be faces, just because the audience was so different. But those guys that were in the late '90s, they would have been hated back in the '80s. Mm-hmm. They would have been guys that nobody could stand. Because I would put Ravishing Rick Rude in that same category of the style of heel you're seeing in the '80s comparatively to what you saw during the Attitude Era. Nobody liked Rick Rude, but I remember even as a kid, I was like, man, this guy's really cool. Even though he would come out there and make fun of the people and he would do all these things to get cheap heat, he would still be able to, get. And again, he's one of those guys that we'll see later on as we go through doing these matches. We'll see more of those type of guys. But so overall 3 across the board there. And then we had the ladies championship, which was Leilani Kai with the Fabulous Moolah, a legend in women wrestling, with Wendy Richter and what's her name?
Cyndi Lauper.
Cyndi Lauper as her manager. So I actually really enjoyed this match. I gave it 3.5 stars. Women's wrestling was just so different back then, and neither of these individuals, I guess you could say, were lookers. I mean, Wendy Richter was okay looking and could probably fit in as a diva nowadays, like you said during a show. But man, I'll tell you, there was hair pulling. They were using slams and just everything that they were doing. It was an aggressive match. It was a fast paced match.
It was definitely physical.
Yep.
It wasn't you got all the high flying moves that you have today. It was pretty much a good brawl. between the two, and it was a rematch because Wendy had lost the belt to she was trying to get the belt back. You had the Rock and Wrestling connection. Again, Vince McMahon, trying to really branch out the WWF, through all types of media. As he was, the WWF was on the rise to prominence at that point in time. Hence you had Cyndi Lauper, who learned how to be a manager from Captain Albano.
Yeah.
So it was definitely an entertaining match. I gave it only a 3, just because I didn't like the finish, where when she did, when she, the champ came off the top rope, hit Wendy, and just the rollover just wasn't that smooth, and it was just kind of after a really exciting match. It was just kind of the finish seems just a little slow for normally what you expect to be a more fast paced maneuver. It just it seemed just slow and kind of rough. They had a rough time with that particular move.
And I think it
kind of dropped it down just a little bit. It's not as strong a finish as I'd like to have seen.
It looked to me like it was Laney Kai's fault because she's supposed to come off. She's supposed to hit that high crossbody and then basically somersault on her way down. And Wendy Richter had to straight up bridge to get herself over in order to flip back over on top of her. And it was a little awkward. I didn't want that to ruin the way I felt about that whole match. It was but yeah, overall when you see a match like that, I remember somebody watching wrestling with me in Korea, and they had never seen a women's match really from back then. They only knew new wrestling stuff. And I remember he watched it and he looked at me and said, "That's the greatest women's match I've ever seen in my life." And it was exciting, and I really enjoyed it. It was the second best match in the card, in my opinion.
I'd agree with you there.
And then, so the final match, I kind of felt was a little bit of a stinker. We had Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff versus Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. You also had Cowboy Bob Orton and Superfly Jimmy Snuka in the corners. Cowboy Bob Orton working with Roddy and Jimmy Snuka working with Hulk Hogan. What'd you think of this matchup?
I enjoyed it, but more just for seeing, again, just the classic heels, Orndorff, Piper, Cowboy Bob Orton, and just kind of enjoying their feuds with, Hogan. You could tell, just in watching the match, Mr. T was having a rough time with it, and just and reading some of the various autobiographies that are out there, he wasn't really taking it as seriously as the wrestlers wanted him to. He was having a tough time keeping his wind, you could see. But it was definitely enjoyable to see Hogan in his prime, against Piper and Orndorff in the prime. They had a lot of good, good in-ring chemistry. All the guys looked strong. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. And you could, definitely see all the, again, just that sports entertainment. You had Liberace out there as the timekeeper. You had, Muhammad Ali as the, outside of the ring enforcer. But just the match, with Mr. T, I hate to say, brought the match down. Because really, Hogan had to pretty much carry the team there as far as the actual wrestling in the ring. With Piper and Orndorff, and he could. But, just if he had a different partner, I'm sure, the actual match, as a match would have been a lot more entertaining. As, as just spectacle entertainment, it was definitely entertaining. Piper, Orndorff, they knew how to work the crowd, and no one could do it better. But overall, I gave it a 2.5.
I think a lot of credit had to go to Roddy Piper in this matchup because, he's really the one that got in there and was really trying to interact with Mr. T. Hulk Hogan did carry the match from the perspective of their side, but on the opposite side, it almost looked to me like Paul Orndorff really was sort of giving Mr. T the business at parts in that match. He wasn't going to let him up. He wasn't going to let him do anything. He was going to be content on keeping him down and showing him that wrestling wasn't, was no joke. Because I think, it was one of those things where it looked like a guy they tried to bring in off the street. He was a good athletic, guy, but he's not a wrestler. Yeah. And I think that's really what they were trying to prove with that too, the stuff that was going on with Mr. T. I think that just a lot of it, he just didn't look like a wrestler in that match. He looked like just sort of out of place.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say, I could be wrong. It's been years since I read his autobiography, Hogan's autobiography. But I think he said, he talked about how, there was, a little bit of heat, with between T and, Piper and Orndorff, and the fact that they, weren't appreciative of T's attitude. And so they probably, they probably did want to kind of, teach him a little bit of a lesson in the ring. Not like, injure the guy, but definitely kind of give him a hard time.
And you might be a little stiff with him, in there. I gave this match a 2, based purely on entertainment value. The wrestling involved was crap, to be honest. Even the stuff Hulk was pulling out with Orndorff and Mr. T. It was nice to see Hulk get dominated a little bit. Paul Orndorff definitely pulled off some moves that you haven't seen Hulk Hogan do, because he was still getting slammed around in the early 80s. So for me, kind of underwhelming as a finish to the pay-per-view, but overall I gave this pay-per-view in general 2.5 stars overall. It was just an average WrestleMania. At the time, in 1984, I'm sure if you sat down and you watched this, it was probably one of the greatest things you'd ever seen at that time, because you'd never seen that many matches probably in one night, and then not the type of talent that you were seeing, and then all the celebrities and everything else that came in.
Yeah, so. Definitely average WrestleMania. Just by the simple fact, the whole beginning of the night, you just had, it was something you could have just seen on, WWF Superstars, on a Saturday morning. But as the night progressed, the matches got better. It was definitely enjoyable hearing Jesse Ventura, Jesse the Body, commentate with Gorilla Monsoon. That was probably one of the most enjoyable aspects of watching this whole pay-per-view. Probably 2 of my favorite commentators together. So, but definitely the quality of the matches in the early of the night bring down the overall event.
One other thing
and the finish.
I would say one other thing I think that was really missing is everybody else got a promo. Why did Roddy Piper not get a promo? The guy is so good on the mic, and you don't give him an Orndorff a promo prior to the main event match. Same thing with, you didn't see Hogan or Mr. T or anything prior.
Yeah, you didn't have any build of a real any explanation as to, even just a little quick review as to why this match was happening.
Yeah.
So unless you were watching the wrestling, which you would have been, if you were watching this back in the 80s, watching when it happened on pay-per-view, but otherwise there was still no in-ring, no story explanation as why is Mr. T wrestling with Hulk Hogan. So I know it's probably the whole Rocky III connection and whatnot, but again, just the lack of and also just a basic problem with the entire event. It's the first one, so they're still finding their way. There's just there's no storyline to get you invested in the matches.
What would you think the best promo of the night was?
I'd say Nikolai Volkov, the Iron Sheik.
Yeah.
With Freddie Blassie.
Yeah, that was a good one at the end. I think the other one that stuck out to me pre-match is I actually liked Tito's in the beginning. It was one of those ones where I don't remember him really talking too much, but you could just see the confidence level of him when he went in to do his promo. The one of the more awkward ones for me was the David Sammartino one. You could tell he definitely wasn't comfortable yet being in front of a microphone. But Andre the Giant, Big John Studd. Of course, you had Bobby Heenan to help out there. So
that was definitely entertaining.
Yeah, you can't really go wrong whenever you have Bobby Heenan talking. So, yep, sounds like we had, what was it, about 2.5 hours?
Yeah, I'd say about that.
Yeah, so about a 2.5 hour event. So for that period of time, that's a lot of wrestling going on all at once, and because there wasn't a lot of storyline involved, it was pretty much nonstop. They had very, very few things to interrupt the matches. The only time it kind of drug on was for that main event match, because you had to bring out the ring announcer, and then you brought out the enforcer, and so overall, can't say I was disappointed in it, especially being the first one. There was a lot of good nostalgic value for that, but looking forward to doing WrestleMania 2.
Sure, yep, looking forward to it.
On down the road, but
Hulk Hogan and King Kong Bundy.
Yep. And was that a cage match? It was, wasn't it?
I think it might have been.
Yeah.
And then you had the Battle Royal with the NFL superstars.
Yeah, which is good and bad, I suppose. They actually did a pretty good job, I remember, from what I remember in that match. Refrigerator Perry and all that. But, this is going to be the RATHSQUATCH Yab signing off with their retro wrestling reviews, WrestleMania I. Thank you.